Good morning.
Hello. Okay, Steven is here.
Okay, perhaps we can start. Right.
Yeah. Steve is not yet with us, I think.
1, 2, 3.
Steven's here, yeah. I think we're all here, huh, Slavko?
I don't see Steve. Steve Barnett.
Ah, Bernay. Oh, you're right, yeah.
Okay, I sent him a message, but perhaps he's going to join us at 11. Let's start then.
Let's start. So I would like to welcome all the speakers as well as the participants to this first of two expert panels entitled The Future of Public Service Media, organized by Slovenian Academy of Sciences and Arts Development Council. I'm happy to announce that in the last moment, Professor Stephen Coleman from the University of Leeds was also able to join us. Before I give the floor to our first speaker, I would like to remind the panelists of their time limit of 15 minutes. Likewise, I would like to ask the members of the audience to hold their questions and comments until the end of presentations. Good. Then I now give the floor to our first speaker, the Vice President of the Development Council of the Slovenian Academy of Sciences and Arts, Slavko Splichal, for some introductory words. Slavko, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Boris, and dear colleagues and friends. On behalf of the Development Council of the Slovenian Academy of Sciences and Arts, I'm pleased to welcome you to the conference on the future of public service media. For your information, our council is a kind of mini public. We organize public open access debates on critical societal issues with potentially long-term consequences to draw decision makers' attention to them, which is in a way the definition of the public. More than 15 years ago, I paraphrased the famous dictum about what democracy is or ought to be by defining public service media in normative terms as being of the public and providing a service for the public and by the public. It is, or it should be, a service of the public because it's financed by it and should be governed by it. It's a service for the public, intended to shape the public, and it's a service by the public, which means that the public should make influence and supervise media policy. My understanding of public service media is based on centuries of critical studies of publicness related to the press and later to broadcast media. And it conceptually derives primarily from Dewey's notion of the public. The media are key to constituting the public, and this is, in my view, the essence of determining the nature of public service media. So public service media ought to be an organ of the public and thus a cornerstone of democracy, which should be reflected both in the nature of its contents and in the constitution of the public. The public can only be created if the media, which are accessible to all, make visible all social developments that have significant consequences for society. Awareness of socially important cultural, economic, and political developments is a prerequisite for critical public debate and communicative cooperation between different social actors, which must be facilitated by the media. And in this way, public opinion can be formed that influences societal decision makers and legitimizes their decisions. And in that sense, what we are doing at the Council, at the Academy of Science is a kind of, as I said, mini public. So public service media are part of an institutional communication structure that normatively approximates the so-called public sphere. Ideally, all media, including the internet, should be the embodiment of publicness and part of the public sphere. But nevertheless, the principle of publicness could best be implemented in public service media, organized in such a way as to ensure universal access to all and freedom from commercial and political pressures in making important social transactions visible to the public. The idea of public service media substantially departs from the idea of public service in general, as it is not derived from the relationship of the service provider with the customer, but from the principle of publicness. While every public service is somehow linked or related to human rights, which means that certain tangible or intangible goods and services that are fundamental to human existence should be universally provided. But not every public service is a service to the public. For example, public service is clearly not a service to the public if it provides private consumers or users with material goods such as gas or services such as healthcare. In the early stages of its development, the internet seemed to democratize social communication by providing equal opportunities and universal access to digital communication media. But through decades of development and technological and proprietary upgrades, in quotation marks, of the early internet, its democratic affordances have been largely degraded, freed from democratic momentum, and trapped in the communication inequalities that characterized mass communication in late capitalism. The question of how to meet democratic normative expectations in practice has always been difficult to answer. All public service media have always been exposed to challenges of new technologies, changes in the economy, and often also to political pressures to make them politically dependent. But these challenges have never seemed as important and demanding as in today's Europe. This is especially true for some Central East European countries, including Slovenia, where we are facing the spread of Viktor Orban's quite famous now illiberal model of media control. Anyhow, once again, I warmly welcome our guest speakers to discuss very important challenges facing the public service media in the age of digitalization and the so-called economy of attention in Europe and beyond. which hopefully will help to rebuild the democratic potential of the media and the internet. So welcome and thank you again. And now I return the microphone to Boris. Here we go, Boris.
Thank you, Slavko. Now I'm inviting Karen Donders, a professor at the Vrije Universiteit Brussels and director of public value, talent and organization at Flemish public broadcaster VRT. Professor Donders, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Boris. Thank you also, Slavko and Boris, for inviting me. That's really a big honor for me to be part of this event at what I understand is a very important and perhaps also troubled time for public service media in Slovenia. I prepared a couple of slides. I will see if I can share that. Voila. Normally you should be able to see that.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So for those that have a good eye, you will see the tower on the slide also behind me. So that's the broadcast tower of VRT, the Flemish public broadcaster. I'll immediately make a disclaimer that obviously nothing what I say in this presentation represents the opinion of VRT, blah, 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 blah. But I think you all understand the disclaimer, so I will keep it short. I would like to reflect with you a bit on a question I addressed in a book I published a year ago on public service media in Europe, Theory, the Law and Practice. And the basic question that I set out from in that book was, is there a mismatch between the theory, the law and practice of public service media in Europe? Now, a lot of you will be saying, yeah, duh, asking the question is kind of answering it at the same time. I think that also explains why there is so much scholarship on public service media, because if it all would be perfect, it would not be such an interesting phenomenon to study. And I would also, without repeating too much of what Slavko has said, like to take a step back to, what is public service media? And I think, Slavko, you already made that point. That public service media is there to contribute to certain public interest objectives, not in the least, also to contributing to a powerful public sphere in democracy. And I think essentially the whole idea of public service media is that by making use of innovative, creative, diverse, high quality content, whether that's digital or whether it's traditional radio or television content, essentially it aims to contribute to pluralism, to diversity, to some sort of social cohesion in society. And if you look at the huge amount of scientific research on public service media, then you actually see that most scholars actually argue, and I think, Slavko, you also did that public service media is there to strengthen citizenship. That can be political citizenship, that can be social citizenship, cultural citizenship, or can relate also to civic citizenship, the individual rights of the citizen and empowerment therein. And there is actually also, I don't need to explain that to this audience, there is a lot of empirical research that also shows that public broadcasters actually strengthen citizenship. There is a lot of research that shows that countries with strong public broadcasters have better informed citizens, that there is less polarization in countries with strong public broadcasters, that in countries with public broadcasters you have more attention for minority culture, for example. So you actually have quite a lot of research over the last few decades that demonstrates the value of public service media. Now, having said that, you also are aware of that. There is a lot of research that also demonstrates the opposite, and that actually shows that public broadcasters can be instrumentalized in quite perverse government and state policies, and actually do not contribute to social cohesion, or do not contribute to empathy for the situation of others. I discussed this, for example, quite extensively with my colleague from Poland, with Michał Glowaci, who demonstrates how Polish public broadcasting is actually contributing to a division in society. is adding to fear of LGBTQI plus groups in society, for example. And so we have actually research that points in an opposite direction when it comes to public broadcasters contributing to citizenship, yes or no. And I think the fundamental question in this discussion is, can public service media contribute to citizenship and in so doing to democracy in a context that is moving away from democracy? So we have a lot of research that actually shows or sets out from the belief that public broadcasters strengthen democracy, but does the reverse relationship also hold? Is democracy also strengthening public service media? So is there more of an iterative relationship between the two? And in my book, I, of course, conclude that that is indeed the case, and that we need some basic level of democratic values to ensure that public service media can work. And I know that's a bit of an inconvenient question, because nowadays we see that not only in the US, but I took this picture because I thought it was so completely surreal what happened that day at the Capitol. But not only in the US, but also in Europe, there are plenty of examples, and not only the cases that are usually being raised, Poland and Hungary, but there are more examples of countries where we see that liberal democracy is under pressure, that there is a rise of populism and signs of neo-authoritarianism, and definitely anti-democratic movements, and that political and economic elites are taking control, I would say, again, of the media. And my argument also in the book was that that does not only happen in the east and south of Europe, also in the west and north of Europe, we see a strong rise of populism that clearly puts pressure on public broadcasters. It also results in self-censorship of journalists that feel threatened, definitely by social media and Twitter criticism. And it's something, for example, also we as public broadcasters struggle a lot with, because self-censorship is something very difficult to study. So you kind of, flying blind there, in the sense that, is this happening, yes or no? But coming back to the essential question, can public service media play its role in terms of strengthening citizenship in the absence of robust democracies? There, basically, my answer is a bit provocatively, also to kickstart the discussion a bit. There, my answer is actually no. This is a bit much perhaps on one slide, but it's the theoretical framework I work with in my book. And basically what I try to argue in the book is that public broadcasters, so the centralized organizational unit that has traditionally been used to realize public service media, to realize the public interest in media, depends on some necessary conditions. And those you see in the left top corner and down corner. Public broadcasters need to be transparent, accountable, and they also need to trust that there is some sort of reliability of the system in which they work in. And on the other hand, governments need to ensure independence, adequate funding, but also, even when they sometimes criticize public broadcasters, which I think should happen, but at least government also should show a fundamental trust in this model as a functioning model, and not in a model as kind of convenient that they can seize control over a centralized public broadcasting organization. And what you see definitely in a lot of European countries, that these necessary conditions are not being fulfilled, and not like marginally not being fulfilled, because there is always obviously some tension there, but you see a big deficit there. Then sometimes people tell me, Karen, that's an incredibly depressing story, because what is the way out of this? And I really have come to believe that we need to put public interest before organization. I think a lot of scholars always try to defend public broadcasters, and you might expect from me, working for a public broadcaster, that I would do the same. But actually, I really think, I've done a lot of research on public broadcasting in Poland, for example. I really think that some public broadcasting organizations, even though they're very valuable and genuine and authentic and ethical people working for them, that some public broadcasters are beyond salvation, and so that we should think about other models to realize the public interest in media. And then we obviously soon start talking about community media, alternative media that sometimes very often lack the scale to really have an impact on the audience. And I think there is still a lot of research to be done there on how we can make sure that it's not the state broadcaster that has a monopoly over all these ambitions that we would like media to realize. So I'm not making the argument. I also don't know the Slovenian situation as well as I know other national situations in Europe. So I'm definitely not making the argument here to abolish Slovenian public service media. But I do think that it would be wise to do more research on how in non-democratic contexts we should not overly rely on the centralized system that also is quite can easily be abused from a power perspective. So these are a few of the insights I would like to share. I think I have finished my 15 minutes by that, Boris, or perhaps 14, looking at my clock. So I want to thank you for your attention. I'm looking forward to the other presentations and also to the discussion later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karen, for those provocative thoughts. You're very well in the time limit yet, don't worry. Now our next speaker is Barbara Thomas. She's professor at the Ruhr University Bochum, member of the ZDF Board of Directors. Professor Thomas, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I would love immediately, thank you, Karen, for this introduction. Thank you for the invitation first and organizing this conference. I would love to enter into the discussion immediately with you because I remember a wonderful book which I would like to recommend here from Timothy Snyder about on tyranny. And one of his sayings is, one of his lections there is to say, defend institutions, if you want to defend. So this would be a wonderful thing. But my presentation fits very well to you because you said that we see, of course, the pressure ongoing on public service broadcasting as well in the West. And I want to give an example how this works here in Germany, which I would say has still, of course, I don't only say this, our Media for Democracy monitor shows that as well, has a very strong and quite well organized public service broadcasting system. But as I will show, we are here now in the middle of a process of renewing the media law for public service broadcasting. And I will analyze this with a focus on entertainment to show how this pressure works. Before, I just want to give a very short overview of how governance is organized in Germany. And then we'll go into this debate about the new media law. Now, of course, it's an institution in Germany under public law, which means no commercial, not privately owned. But what is important is the governance of our public service broadcasters, which is done on the one hand in the broadcasting councils, and on the other hand in the administrative council or the board, where I am a member of. And the broadcasting council is constituted by many representatives of civil society organizations, political parties and churches, trade unions and so on, who are elected by these organizations. And then the Broadcasting Council elects the Administrative Council or the board, if you want. We have this special situation that 1/3, now only 1/3, before it was more, are allowed to have governmental functions in these bodies. This is compared to the Slovenian draft of the media law, more politicians, but finally they have nevertheless less influence because the majority is really elected from civil society. And their roles is then the appointment of the managing directors and the editors-in-chief. So there is a very big distance to politics by this way of electing from those representatives of civil society, them then electing the management. And as well, the organization of the funding is done in a very, very long arms away from government, because it is an independent organization, the Commission for Settling the License Fee, which is doing in a rather long and iterative process how the license fee is settled. So just very much in brief, I could talk endlessly of this, but this is not what I want to focus on. The focus here is that we are in the middle of this, what I said, the reform of the media law, with a special focus on, as it is called, optimization of the remit and optimization of the structure. Now I want to explain what is at stake and what is the background of all this. We have to go a little bit back in German history to understand the overall frame. And this is as a consequence of the unification. Of course, the Western part of public service broadcasting was the model for how public service broadcasting is organized in Eastern Germany. And therefore, German public service broadcasting is said or is criticized for being too much orientated to the Western part of Germany and not enough considering Eastern German issues and interests. This topic entered in the debate about the last augmentation of the license fee. So the license fee was used as an argument or as more as an instrument to influence this orientation, how much reporting, how much orientation to Eastern Germany, although we have to say the constitutional law does not want to give space for such interventions with a license fee. So license fee and content has to be separated completely, all the procedures on this. But this effort failed. I can't go into this, but just it is a background. And subsequently, media politicians then tried to appease these East German critiques, but these are as well general critiques of public service media, by promising, and here we are, to sharpen the mandate or the remit of the public service broadcasters and also to tighten its internal structure in order to make it more efficient and save money. So this is why it is called about the remit and the structural optimization. And now the result is a new draft for the media law with new provisions for public service media. And I want just to focus, there is one important focus on how to change the settings for settling the license fee, but I want to focus here on the issue that of entertainment. The new draft law demands a more precise notion and sharpening the concept of public service quality, especially with respect to entertainment. Now, how is this done? In the draft, entertainment is first removed from the general mission statement, which stood in the former form next to education, information, and counseling. In addition, the draft proposed that public service programs should focus on culture, education, information, and counseling, so away from entertainment. And then it is specified that entertainment should only be included in the remit if it corresponds to a public service profile. This is in the text. So in this context, the interplay of the definitions in the interstate treaty on the media must also be taken into account, because on one hand, the term entertainment is legally defined in the interstate treaty, and it is cabaret, comedy, film, series, show, talk shows, games, music, and so on. But suddenly, certain things could be then excluded from the mandate of public service broadcasting solely by the virtue of their respective mode of production. So that's a problem here. And accordingly, in contrast to the current wording of the interstate treaty, certain parts of the entertainment are hereby just cut out of the mandate. And in addition, the wording in the focus reinforces this sort of limitation of the mandate. The narrowing of the mandate interferes with the program autonomy of the broadcasters, which is laid down in the Constitution, and it is in a constitutionally impermissible manner how this is now narrowed down. According to the established case law of the Federal Constitutional Court in Germany, broadcasters have their right to program autonomy, because program autonomy guarantees that the public broadcasters can decide how to fulfill its communicative and journalistic tasks free from external influences. And this is a basic prerequisite to enable free reporting and broadcasting. Thus, this program autonomy, which is a constitutionally based right, with the exclusion of the stipulation or the use of certain styles and formats for public service media. So there's a conflict. Moreover, and this I find even more important than these sort of legal considerations, these restriction to that legal institutions could define what is public service quality entertainment. These restrictions would pose a fundamental problem. The question would have to be answered as to which criteria should be applied for a film, for example, in order to determine whether it corresponds to a special public service profile in the sense of exclusion. And ultimately, this decision must not be left to the courts, but to the public service program makers themselves, or the artists, or those who are supervising public service broadcasting, and this is civil society and the councils. The understanding and the debate of what constitutes a public service profile must be, and this is here my central argument, this must be part of an ongoing social discourse which takes place in the broadcasting councils, but as well in the continuous dialogue of the broadcasters with the audience and the social groups. Legalizing this discussion, so putting it in a law and then giving third persons and parties the possibility to go to sue the public service broadcaster, this is not public service quality, and bringing it before the courts. So by legally stipulating a public service profile would cut off this discussion to the detriment of the further development of public service media. So the guarantee of freedom of opinion, which is a very fundamental sentence, of course, in our constitutional law, of the basic law, also contradicts the spirit of a legal definition of public service profile. Now, I want to talk very shortly about what are the interests and the conflicts behind that this law now is set up. I told you about the development, how it came to be an issue, talking about this sharpening the remit, but what are the interests and conflicts behind? The focus on entertainment here is a very, very smart spin of the Doyle spin doctrine, a very interesting move, because legit is in recent times the critiques from, and they come mainly from privately owned media, that the program is too shallow, too many crime stories, too much sports, and so on and so on. Fact is that public service media in Germany are, in traditional broadcasting, ahead of commercial broadcasters, and that they run up in competing with their catch-up services and platforms to the commercial platforms like Amazon Prime or Netflix and on. So the demand for a more precise concept of entertainment in public service media beyond this context aims at rising the quality of public service media to a, let's say, highbrow level, where it will have difficulties to allocate the budget, and worse, it will lose attraction to broad audiences. And it is very interesting to know, this is more a rumor, but I'm quite sure it is, we will find the reasons for that. This suggestions comes from the Liberal Party, who are in Germany majoritarian, very capital friendly. So this is where we are standing. Just for finalizing, how is the process of drafting the law and what is the way ahead? Here again, the democratic functions work quite well. We had a 2-month public consultation where statements about the draft could be made, and we had more than 2,600 submissions from very many political organizations, civil society organizations, as well, of course, the industry, lobbying associations and churches and so on. And they will be now processed, and the draft will be amended until the end of the year. And then an agreement between all the minister presidents of the 16 country states must take place in order that the draft can go into the parliaments to all the 60 parliaments in the country states. And there an unanimity must be reached. If this will be achieved, this is still very, very doubtful when we look at the political landscape in Germany at the moment. So this is from my side a sketch about what is going on in Germany and how, yes, how entertainment and legal arguments can be used to narrow the mandate, which I find very dangerous.
Thank you, Professor Thomas. Now I'm inviting Klaus Unterberger, head of the Public Value Department of ORF Vienna. Klaus?
Okay. Thank you very much. Hello from Austria, Vienna. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm personally some sort of a hybrid person. I'm very much into analyzing public service media for a long time in terms of governance and especially focusing on advocacy. However, at the same time, I'm still working as a journalist, which means that I'd like to contribute quite a grassroots perspective, hopefully also a journalistic perspective, which means I would like to focus, and this is what I'm going to show you in my presentation. Hopefully you can see that now. Can you?
Yes.
Okay, well then. So it is my focus will be not just to breach our eternal values, which is about distinctiveness, being independent and accountable, but focus on the question how we actually could implement those values in real reality. And my focal point is for sure to protect public service media, and it all starts on my side on the public mission for sure. So we have to go to the roots in keeping in mind that public service mission for sure is a different narrative to the commercial sector. You would say, okay, that's a given for granted. We always hear that from the commercial sector saying that we get so much public funding and that would be a privilege. This is why we are so strong, we are so powerful. So let's look just on the real numbers at the moment. And this is the real reality of the media business globally. You can see here the small blue field. Those are the 66 European public service media companies existing in the European Public Broadcasting Union, compared to only 10 European commercial broadcasters, which are almost double as big as all public service media outlets. And so it goes on to the top 10 telecom operators or the top 10 non-European commercial broadcasters. And we end up comparing us with only the 10 biggest internet giants, as we say. And you can see that all of our family, 66 European public service media outlets, compared to the top 10 internet tech giants, they are almost 27 times bigger than our company and our family. So therefore, my message here is, at the moment, if you look at the situation in media economy and also seeing the social and societal disruptions, it's not to protect the market, but it's to protect the public purpose in media. And that's a crucial message to all of the politicians included into the law-making procedures. I'm very happy that Barbara Thomas did reflect on the question of entertainment. I personally do not understand why we're always talking about narrowing down the mandate of public service media. When seeing the political situation in our nations, in Europe, but also globally, it's the contrary that is actually needed. And I promise, if we would exclude entertainment from the mandate of public service media, we will be dead in terms of reach, in terms of the democratic function of public service media, in terms of relevance. So again, it is about to protect the different mindset, the different function in the media ecosystem in order to protect the public purpose, in order to make sure that we are not just having a shareholder perspective, but a stakeholder perspective, that we are not exclusively focusing on consumers when it comes to media, but on citizenship, as Karen correctly pointed out. Secondly, public infrastructure. As said before, public service media is, to my mind, and this is the message to the politicians, not just any other media company delivering some news for target groups. For example, the commercial print sector delivers very high quality news, yeah, for the audiences, but in fact, they are reaching out to a little minority, yeah, to the intellectuals, to the well-educated. But I'm asking here, what's with the rest of us? So therefore, keep in mind that this is a question of the public infrastructure that all boils down to protect the social cohesion, yeah, delivered by public service media. This is a matter of the quality of the public sphere and therefore a matter of relevance for society. Why is that so important? I'm always referring to the actual data of media usage. We know that from Switzerland, and in Switzerland, the biggest media group is this group who have no access to editorial news. Imagine that. This is in the overall population almost 36%, and in the population of the younger ones below 29, these are already 53%. Yeah, who are no longer addicted or having access to editorial news, but only living in their filter bubbles, yeah, with all the fake news stuff and negative effects of that. So therefore, this is a very alarming system of relevance of quality media. So therefore, I pretty much advise to put the question of social cohesion into the law-making procedure. I don't need to be very comprehensive and extended in terms of public funding. What we have learned in Austria, we never would rely on a state budget because that would make us addicted from politicians. Just imagine if the CEO, the Director General, would be forced to negotiate on a yearly basis with the finance minister, or he or she certainly is a politician. And I've never met a politician who doesn't have his own agenda or his hidden agenda. So therefore, I deeply recommend the license fee model. I see that there are some funding, some mixed funding systems operating quite well. But I think the crucial point here is that we should not depend on government or political parties or lobbying. At the same time, also not going into the top slicing model, because this is what the commercial sector always talks about, saying, okay, well, the public funding, they should make a fund, and every single media outlet would get public money from that, yeah, for specific criteria. I do not recommend to go into that top slicing model, because it will simply mean to abolish the infrastructure I've been talking about, and simply would lead to the fact that public money would go into private revenues of shareholder value. So therefore, sustainable funding is to protect the systemic function. Why is that relevant? Just to mention that, we've seen, according to global and European studies, that higher public service media market share come along with a greater political interest of citizens and greater confidence in their ability to participate. So I do have an answer for Karen Donder's question, if public service media could support citizenship or not. I do have a different answer. I think yes, definitely, it already does. Maybe not in the way Karen pointed out in her very interesting goals to achieve, but if you compare us with the commercial market, I think the answer is definitely yes. We can see it, it's evident that public service media contributes to democracy in all existing states. So sustainable funding is to protect the systemic function within the media ecosystem. So finally, all boils down to the public law. I don't need to repeat the stakeholder perspective. It's already been said. To my mind, from my experience in Austria, it is absolutely crucial to focus on transparency. That means public hearings for elections and supervising boards of the Director General. There should be no open door for the government. Just have a look what happened in Poland, in Hungary as well. I think this is not acceptable, and this is not just business as usual. So we should take care that those sitting in the supervising boards are not just in charge of, but are really competent. So do have a proven competence. And I'm always pointing out that when defending independence, it's crucial to strengthen the role of the journalists. By editorial guidelines, by maybe a code of conduct we have established in Austria, but focus on the rights for journalists, which means that political bodies, supervising bodies, never can decide on journalistic stuff. If you allow that in your legal system, then we can't talk about any kind of independency. So therefore, it is absolutely needed to exclude a majority of government and political parties' interest in the supervising boards in order to create a protective shield for journalists. And the big picture here, for sure, is to protect the so-called fourth pillar of democracy, which is independent media being in control of politics and business. So therefore, this is actually at stake. Well, I'm speeding up a little bit, going to the last item, which is about public control, because this is about accountability. Accountability cannot be achieved by saying I'm accountable. Why should you believe me? So it's about the possibility and the ability that the public actually can control that. So I highly advise to go into a quality control in public service media. This must be professional for sure, on scientific basis, but not exclusively eternal. Just to give you an example, the regulation board in Austria supervises the structure of the quality control system, but it would never go into journalistic content. So again, it is absolutely crucial that there's a Chinese wall, a protective shield between those who are controlling and the independency of reporting. Of course, it's a good advice to go into a complaint mechanism, into maybe an ombudsman system. That could be a tool, and pretty much focus on advocacy, which is crucial, because we have to learn, we as public service media, that we cannot hide out, but we have to make our public value visible. And I have no time to show you what we did in the last years in Austria, together with all public service media companies, but we invested a lot in quality control system and into the dialogue with the audiences and some target groups. And we invested a lot to develop a young approach to include our next generation into a public value mindset. So therefore, this is important, as public service media is no fortress and certainly not an ivory tower, but it's about to protect quality journalism, even in the law. So there is something missing, which is digital transformation. However, I think I have already expanded my 15 minutes. So I'm excluding that. Maybe I can come back in a few minutes when there's question and answers. But let me just finish up by saying that this is certainly also in the procedure of the lawmaking, a call for action for media policy, for citizenship, as Karen Dondert pointed out, but also for public service media, who has to be a driver of change for the media system. But hopefully we will have the self-reflection which is needed for change in the inside of public service media, but also the self-esteem that we would be able to protect all these values in the real reality of media making and media producing. Thank you very much.
Thank you for these thoughts. Our next speaker, Hannu Nieminen, is a professor at University of Helsinki. And he will be joined by Jonas Olsson. He's a professor at the University of Gothenburg and director of the Nordic Information Center for Media and Communication Research, Nordicom. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Sorry, can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Yes? Is it a full screen or is it a half screen? Should I open it now to the full?
I can see it.
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Let's hope that it works. All right. So thank you very much for inviting me here to this conference, and thank you for all the previous speakers. So I don't have to repeat all the good words and the principles here. What I'm going to speak is more like I will speak about the how to protect the arm's length principle especially in online environment in the public service media here. And I'm using YLA, the Finnish broadcasting company, as an example here. And at the same time, I think I'm commenting also implicitly, at least, the Slovenian draft law that was sent to us beforehand. So I'm not going into details there, but I mean, I try to bring you about the Finnish experience here. The structure of my presentation, if you see it, it is rather short, some background, then what YLA is today, and then some challenges, and then some general principles to protect the arm's length principle in broadcasting. First, background. YLA, of course, it's an old institution. It used to be a public monopoly, as in quite many countries. Now it is a public company which is owned, though, by the state, but it is not a state department. It is an independent company, actually. Its status is cemented in the Special Act on YLA, which is renewed regularly. And it has, also it is in English. You can find it in English through the internet. Audience shares in television. It is of course a major player there on a daily basis. Almost 45% of citizens over 15 years. In radio, the daily reach is again, it's about 35%, which are very high, still high, although they have been decreasing, slowly during the years. The services are mentioned here: 3 television channels, radio channels, streaming service, and so on. Rather, how to say, compact services, like I think in most countries nowadays, European countries nowadays. Its public service provisions, the mission is rather briefly explained in the YLA, Act on YLA. It says that it's a provision of versatile and comprehensive television and radio programming, related additional and extra services for all citizens. And these and other content services related to public service may be provided in public communications networks, nationally and regionally. And it seems that, at least in English, it is rather plain words, plain explanation. So it has a mandate to work and to service people also online without any restrictions. So it seems that it is within the public service mandate. But then we come, here are the particular, the stipulations about the public service contents. What does it include? I don't go here into details. But let's say that just to state that it covers, I think, very nicely what the public service could mean or means actually in the Finnish circumstances for the society, for the democratic needs, for the plurality, for different audiences, for youth, especially mentioned here, for language minorities and everything. So it is a rather compact and well-worded definition, and of course it is amended during the years so that it tries also to function in today's conditions now. And of course, I mean, the public service broadcaster has to report on its activities every year to the Parliament. So there is a special report prepared every year to the Parliament, and the Parliament then can discuss how the conditions, how the stipulations have been fulfilled of the YLA. So then YLA today, financing, again, it is tax-based financing there. Individuals and companies pay the certain amount. It's a special law, again, on the taxes for YLA. It is collected to the special fund, which is certainly situated outside the state budget. So it is an independent fund, and all its income goes directly to the public service media through YLA. Governance, again, is there is an administrative council which is nominated by the parliament. There are 21 members, and according to the law, they include experts in the different fields of society, and so it doesn't say that all are representing those circles, which means that in practice, the places in the administrative council are shared by the parties according to the parliamentary share. So it is mostly consisting on the members of the parliament, but in a consensus principle. So the parties agree on the principle how they are represented. So the administrative council then nominates the board of directors who are then independent people. I mean, who are experts and specialists or whatever they are, not politicians. They are not members of parliament. They are not politicians. They are not, people who are working for the YLA and so on. So then the board of directors, again, it nominates the CEO and the management group, and also it nominates the board of directors. So this is a kind of a system of accountability within the YLA here. So YLA units, again, I think it reminds a little bit what was in the draft law in the Slovenian for the Slovenian Act on broadcasting. My main challenges today, I think that the main challenge actually concerns the online environment, because there is, I'm just referring to whatever Klaus was saying, what Barbara was saying. So there is an abundance of services, and how to fight a certain place, its own place in this kind of competitive, very competitive environment. What are the instruments? What means to use there? YLA has a very successful streaming service, which is called YLA Arena, which is, I think it's the #1 sharing, stream sharing service in Finland nowadays. And it is a contestable, of course, by the commercial companies then. And certainly it has also mobile presence here, YLA News, YLA Live in mobile environment, all these principal things are there. The main problem, I think, for the future is young people, as in all other countries, and a special emphasis has been also put there to the how to reach young audiences, and it is one of the main issues in the new strategy there. Emphasis under the 45 people, but especially for 15 to 29-year-old and for children's services. So it is recognized, and some means and some steps have been taken there. But of course, I mean, it's a question: are they functional then? So here is something about the YLA's reputation and trust among the population here. So here you can see weekly reach is on the upper line here, on blue one. 94% of our population, of the people over 15 years. Daily reach, again, it's the orange or whatever it is, 77%, and then how people are interested in YLA services. So it is here on the red line, 84%. Of course, these are polls that are conducted by the YLA themselves, but again, it shows the trust and interest among the population in Finland. Here is another one again. How well YLA has succeeded in its public service mission. And again, it is the whole population over 15 years old. And it shows a certain kind of curve, the improving curve, if you like, during the couple of years. So there is 6 especially well has managed from 10 to 17, and 5, which is rather well, it is 15 to 49, and so on and so on. So there is a slight increase also on the other side. So small polarization, but mostly people seem to be rather satisfied about the YLA's success here. So now the challenges then, and they are very much they concern very much the online environment nowadays. There has been three major challenges by the media and communications industries in Finland. 2017, Finmedia, which is the representing all the electronic and print media in Finland, companies in Finland. They launched a complaint to the European Commission against wireless services in the online environment. It was against the textual provision of services made directly to the online environment. So the argument was that YLA should restrict its textual contents only what is broadcasted in these normal channels in television and radio. So no other, no extra contents to be published online in online environment. And of course, it was a competition law that was used then as a weapon. The European Commission then gave an initial or interim ruling there, saying that yes, competition law should be followed here. And now the Finnish government then proposed a law restricting YLA's remit mandate in online environment. But because of the ambivalence here, so it is still there under discussion in the parliament. So there is no conclusion yet. The other one again is the Sanoma Corporation, which is the major publishing house in Finland, launched a complaint against the wireless supply on educational online services, which are of course very important and which are not served by the commercial companies. But it's a question about, the remit again. Now it is an open issue. No decision has been made here. And just last month, again, the radio companies, they launched another complaint against YLA's audio contents, radio contents in online, podcast and so on. It is still under consideration, but the YLA Administrative Council is launching now the public value test in this springtime, just to discuss on the issue and to make it clear, what are the arguments. So critical issues in Finland have been during the years quite many. One of the original ones was against the structure. The commercial media wanted to split up YLA and to hand over the other channel, TV2, to the regional press media houses. They didn't succeed there. Concerning programming and contents, as I mentioned, the online services are still there and an issue, and the idea is to reduce wireless services and provision only to the marginal niche services. And then governance issue, an attempt to disentangle, to divide wireless governance from the parliament and to make a kind of independent kind of governance structure there, with the aim of increasing the influence of the commercial private media houses in the wireless governing organs here. And of course, financing then to reduce, freeze and gradually reduce wireless funding, which is now, according to the internal taxation, it is on a rather steady basis nowadays. So then again, the main factors which are defending YLA and safeguarding its position. First one is the parliamentary consensus. So according to the Finnish tradition, there is in the parliament there is a kind of a parliamentary YLA party, which means that there is a consensus. All parties are subscribing to the YLA main principles and to this modus operandi, and that is why the YLA law has been very important. Slight changes, but all the time that with the consensus principle. The second one, of course, is the high audience figures. It is popular. All the channels do have still a slightly decreasing support from the audiences, and of course, the popular trust is very high there. One of the most trusted institutions in Finnish social and political landscape. So now the conditions for the arm's length principle, and this is, I think, the main issue that I want to discuss here. Of course, the arm's length principle means that the PSM public service media must have an autonomy both from the government, which means then the ruling political bloc, and from the media industry. It means independence both in the area of governance structures, and financing models. Now, in the governance area, the main issue seems to be who nominates the highest decision body. In YLA case, it is the Administrative Council, which is nominated by the Parliament with a consensus decision. It might be different case and different condition in other countries. In Finland, it has worked. Who nominates the president or chairperson for the decision body? In YLA's case, it is the Administrative Council by itself who nominates the chairperson there. So it is upon the members to elect the person who is chairing the thing here, which then is a kind of autonomy, but it is a consensus decision, must be then. And who nominates the board of directors and its chair? In the YLA case, it is the Administrative Council, so it is the Administrative Council again. So it is a kind of parliament through the Administrative Council is again here making the decisions or confirming the decisions in this way. And the CEO is then selected by the board of directors, which means it is a kind of independent decision made here, independent because it is not tied to the political organs by the parliament or even the Administrative Council. And the funding, of course, is of crucial issue here, crucial importance. Financing must be independent on the annual state budget, as I think it was by Hans just here. And in Finland, the tax-based funding, it was statuted, I think, in 2013, and nowadays its approval rating has gone up. So it is now, how to say, approved by the majority, clear majority of people. In the beginning, it was not so well, how to say, received, but now it is rather understood. It is a way to go, if you like. And it is collected to the separate fund, which is secure, which use is secured exclusively for the use of the public service media. So the critical conditions, as I have emphasized here, I think there is not really a one-size-fits-all solutions here. Solutions, especially for the governance and also the financing, must be tailored to local environment. But just how to say, respecting this autonomy, this a couple of arm's length principles, the autonomy of the company. And I think the success of this arm's length principle, how it works, autonomy is secured, is really dependent on the level and quality of political culture in the country. So there must be a kind of historical roots for the decision here. Historical background and socio-political trust. I think the trust is a major issue here. If there is a socio-political trust enough, it can work. But then if there is not, I think it's very difficult to create a kind of a governance model that fulfills the criteria. We can see, for example, in the destiny or recent developments in the BBC, how the trust issue has somehow crumbled, if you like, or coming into more and more difficulties. Many thanks for listening. So this was my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. I owe an apology to you and Jonas Olsson. Of course, you both have your separate presentations, so I apologize for my lapsus. And now I would really like to invite Jonas to share his thoughts with us.
Thank you, Boris. Apologies accepted. Greetings from Sweden. It's a big honor for me to be part of this very interesting seminar, and it's also an honor to be representing Scandinavia, which is at least historically has been regarded as something of a stronghold for independent, well-funded public service media. I have some slides to share with you. Just a second. All right. Can you see my
Yes.
screen? Okay,
Yes.
thank you. I've been asked to talk about the present status of public service media in Sweden. I will, when appropriate, I will make some comparisons to the situation in Denmark and Norway as well. But like Hanno, I will start from the beginning. Just a very brief crash course into Swedish public service media history. Public service media was introduced in 1925 with the formation of Sveriges Radio, or Swedish Radio. This was a company which was in many ways modeled after the BBC. It was a monopoly. Advertising was not allowed, and it was funded by license fees. What is interesting here is that the control of Sveriges Radio, or Swedish Radio, was not taken by the state, but handed over to a consortium consisting of the newspaper press, the radio industry, and the popular movements. And this contrasted Sweden from Denmark and Norway, where the public service broadcaster was made a state-owned entity. Public service media in Sweden has never been state-owned. What is also kind of significant for the state's relationship to public service media in Sweden is the close dialogue with the private sector. Swedish Radio was not allowed to have its own news reporting until the 1940s, because it was considered a threat to the newspaper press. So the news reporting of Swedish Radio until the 1940s was provided by the news agency of the Swedish press. In 1956, public service television was introduced. It was not funded as a separate company, but it was managed by, or the broadcasting rights was given to Swedish Radio. This continued until 1979. These past decades had been heavily dominated by the Social Democratic Party in Sweden, and this was reflected in the control and view of media in Sweden as a public good. In the 70s, we had a new government, a right-wing government, who chose to break up Swedish Radio into two separate companies, one for television and one for radio, which were to engage in healthy competition with each other. And this is still the case. And this is also something that contrasts Sweden from the rest of the Nordics. We still have two major broadcasters, one for television and one for radio, with their own independent editorial staffs, which means that most the radio company and the television company have their independent national news organization and local or network of local news organizations. The monopoly for these two companies was lifted in the early 1990s, once again by a new right-wing government with the introduction of first private local radio in 1991, and then in 1992 with the introduction of private national television. Both these regulations were very much inspired by the notion of public service. So the idea was from the government side was to introduce privately funded media with a public service aim, and that was especially true for TV4, which was given state funding to provide private service media. And this was the same case in Denmark and Norway. So what occurred in the Scandinavia in the 1990s was this kind of hybrid broadcaster, which was privately funded, but with a public service mandate. What happened here, or what caused problems for the public service media or the ownership of the public service media, is that when the markets were opened, newspaper companies started investing in radio and television, which put them in conflict with their ownership of public service. So they wanted to opt out, and a new form of ownership had to be introduced. And what was finally decided was to put the public service broadcasters into a new foundation. So since the 1990s, public service media in Sweden has been owned by a foundation. Moving to more recent developments, with the introduction of digital TV, digital terrestrial TV in the early, I think it was in 2005, the public service broadcasting provisions of TV4 were lifted, since the market was opened up to other players. TV4 subsequently shut down all their news, local news reporting. Since they no longer had to do it, they didn't find it profitable enough, so they shut it down. And this was quite a big thing in Sweden. I think this was in 2014. What has happened is there has been a very significant restructuring of both the private radio market and television markets in Sweden. What we have now is effectively a duopoly in the radio market, with German Bauer Media and the Swedish Nent Group controlling virtually all local news channels, private radio channels. In the television market, there are three companies controlling virtually all private terrestrial television channels. This speaks to what Klaus talked to earlier. We've seen a really big shift of power in the terms of the relative size of the media players in Sweden, because 15 or even 10 years ago, the public service broadcasters were the largest media companies active in Sweden. What we've seen now with the entrance of the likes of Bauer, Nent, Discovery, Swedish radio and Swedish television are now the smallest players on the national radio and television market. And that does not include, of course, the great impact of digital giants like Spotify and Netflix. So there's been a big shift of powers in the Swedish media market. Nonetheless, Swedish radio maintains a very dominant position in terms of reach in the analog broadcasting network, over 70%. Swedish television is, by a hair, the largest television broadcaster in terms of market reach, with 35%. Swedish television is by far the most popular news media in Sweden. It reaches digitally or online and offline. It reaches more than half of the population with their news reporting every day. This share has increased significantly during the pandemic. Swedish audiences have to a very big extent turned to public service media to get news reporting on the pandemic. Swedish radio and Swedish television are also by far the most trusted media outlets in Sweden. They top all rankings. Also, if we include other national institutions, public service media maintain a very high level of trust among the Swedish audience, or Swedish public as a general. Also, trust levels have increased during the pandemic. But there are also, of course, clouds on the horizon. Sorry, I'm ahead of myself. I forgot this one. Just a few words about this peculiar situation of financing and structuring of public service. Sweden has a public service tax since 2019, same as Finland. A tax has now been introduced in all 5 Nordic countries. So the Nordics have shifted from in recent years have shifted from a license funding model to a tax funding model. Like in Finland, the public service tax is separated from the state budget, and it's based on individual income, a maximum of 1% of the income of the adult population, and advertising is still not allowed. The broadcasting license for the public service media is given by the government. The present license runs for 6 years. After that, the period will be extended to 8 years, and this is a means to limit the political impact of the public service broadcasting. So now in the future, they will have an 8-year period without their remits being shifted. Online activities is not included in the license mission. So the license missions is still very much tilted towards traditional broadcasting, but this is under revision, and the ambition is to also include online activities in some way in the starting in 2016. The control of compliance is not carried out by the government, but by a separate authority called the Swedish Broadcasting Commission, and it's only done on after complaints by citizens. So it's a reactive authority. It is also this authority that approves the annual mission reports given by the public service broadcasters. And this commission, it's politically independent, and presently it consists of lawyers and some researchers and some media representatives. A few words on the ownership structure of public service media in Sweden. As I said, this was introduced in 1994. This foundation owns all the shares of the public service broadcasting companies, and it was thought of as kind of a buffer between the political sphere and the public service broadcasting. Foundation ownership is very popular in the Scandinavian countries, and it's this is an instrument that is well known here and something that was introduced to the public service as well. However, it's not entirely independent because the board members of the foundations are appointed by the parliament according to the relative size of the political parties. Since 2020, however, no active members of parliament are allowed to be members of the board. The main task of the board is to appoint the boards of directors of the public service companies, and the foundation board as well as the company boards are explicitly prohibited from intervening in editorial matters of the public service broadcasters. All right, so as I said in the beginning, public service traditionally has a very strong position in Scandinavia among audiences and among in the political sphere. This is changing. This graph shows the annual reach of the main terrestrial channels of Swedish radio and Swedish television divided into different age groups. And we can see kind of a dramatic decrease in reach the younger the people that we study. Public service maintains a remarkable reach among older audiences, but of course is finding it increasingly difficult to reach the younger audiences. Even though, of course, public service media have activities online, the reach is significantly lower among younger audiences. And of course, this is a major problem for the broadcasters moving forward, since we know this intimate connection between trust and reach when it comes to the position of public service broadcasters. Also politically, there have been some changes. Public service media has not been a very politicized topic in Sweden. That is changing. And we see now a gradual, over the past 10 years or so, a gradual increase in political divisions or divisions in the view of the public service depending on party affiliation. And this development has been led by the growth of the Swedish Democrats, which is a right-wing populist party in Sweden, which is whose supporters are significantly have significantly less trust in the public service broadcasters than the rest of the population. And this division has also increasingly been reflected in the political discourse, political debates. We see a division between left-wing parties and right-wing parties with regards to the future of public service media in Sweden, which we didn't do in the past. We see especially the right-wing parties with the Conservatives, with the Christian Democrats, with the Sweden Democrats, proposing and speaking more openly about initiatives to limit the remit of public service media, to make it narrower, and also reading between the lines. It is evident that a lot of right-wing politicians find public service media left-tilted. So there are initiatives proposed by the political parties to increase the editorial overview of the performance of the public service media with regards to their autonomy and independence. So things are slowly changing also in Scandinavia with regards to the position of public service broadcasting. That's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonas. I'm inviting our next speaker, Stephen Bernay. He's a professor at the University of Westminster.
Hi, thank you. Apologies for being late and actually missing the first bit. I'm afraid in true British style, I assumed that 10 a.m. meant 10 a.m. UK time, forgetting that, of course, we're completely out of line with the rest of Europe in this, as in so many other ways. So many thanks for the invitation. I don't have any slides, so you'll just have to kind of look at me, and apologies for that. I'm assuming that that everyone can sort of can see and hear me. I've been fascinated by what I have heard so far, and it sort of fits in essentially with what I'm going to say. I'm not going to be talking about PSB or PSM. I am really going to be talking about the BBC because I think that was my brief, and the extent to which I think there are lessons to be learned, or there is relevance for other PSM institutions around Europe. I'm sure everyone knows that we are now in the BBC's centenary year, and I'm conscious that the BBC is often advanced as a sort of role model and a benchmark for other countries, with some reason. The BBC still, I think, has a worldwide reputation for truth-telling and impartiality. It's the oldest PSB in the world, and I still find it astonishing, to be honest, that an institution that was founded in an era when cinema was in its infancy survives today as an integral part of British culture and economic life, with essentially the same funding model, the license fee, as when it started. It is still, I'm interested to hear what we just heard about Sweden, because the BBC is still the go-to source for trusted news and information in Britain. It still accounts for over half of all radio listening. I think radio is often forgotten in terms of PSM. And it still, like in Sweden, commands the respect and affection of a majority of the British public. There are some small signs of change. I want to talk about the roots of the BBC's strength, and how identifying those strengths might provide some guidance to other countries wanting to shore up their own independent public media. But I'm going to end with some caveats, because it's easy to be complacent about the BBC's status as a benchmark broadcaster and public service institution. And I think this has been said many times before, but it's probably under greater threat now than at any time in its 100-year history. And I think there are lessons to be learned in countering such threats. So let me kick off with what I think are the 5 core strengths of the BBC that have ensured its survival over 100 years of not just obviously huge political and financial upheavals, but massive technological change. The first is scale. The BBC has been big enough to ensure that it can never easily be reduced to a marginalized presence in people's lives. The obvious analogy is with PBS in America or ABC in Australia. I think the biggest, the most important development as technology advanced for the BBC was that it ensured that it operated across all platforms. So in terms of the evolution of the BBC's strength, its pioneering work on the iPlayer, guaranteeing that all its material from TV and radio was easily accessible and downloadable online, was absolutely key. It was then, as it has often been in its history, a technology pioneer, and that has meant that it stayed relevant to the lives of its paying public, and there was never really a challenge to the BBC as an online provider. It was seen as a perfectly natural continuation of its role in public life. So that's scale. The second strength is scope, and that means investing in UK talent across the board, not just news, education and information, where public institutions are generally expected to thrive. If you take things like children's programs, the BBC is most parents' first choice for children's material, not just on TV, but radio and online as well, because of its original British content and British cultural references. So they like to think that their kids won't grow up with more knowledge of Los Angeles than London. There's music. The BBC's invested heavily in orchestras, classical music, pop music, supporting hundreds of live events every year, and actually is key to bringing through some of Britain's new musical talent. One of my favorite bands, which some of you may have heard of, is Florence and the Machine, but you may not know that it actually owes its success to a BBC radio program that sets out to produce new indie talent. There's obviously the role of the World Service in extending Britain's soft power, a global reach that's expected this year to hit 500 million people. But I think most importantly, the BBC's got a long history of investing in things like drama, sports coverage, entertainment and comedy, developing new talent in popular programming, which is especially important when, like all countries, we're faced with the tide of mainly American material featured on the US-based streaming services. The BBC's contribution to the UK creative economy today is estimated at nearly £5 billion and supporting over 50,000 jobs. So the cultural value in terms of telling British stories to British audiences is also matched by the economic value. And that certainly for those on the right of UK politics has always been a very powerful argument. So the second strength is scope. The third is reach. I'm sorry if I missed some of the early presentations, but I think this is probably one of the most important areas for any public institution now. Universality of access has been a fundamental principle that has underpinned the BBC from the very beginning, when transmitters were built at great expense to reach a few outlying homes in the Highlands of Scotland and the valleys of Wales. And I think this is actually probably now one of the most important criteria for public institutions in an age of information silos and subscription-based walled gardens. The BBC is available to every single household. I don't know, perhaps we could talk later about what is happening elsewhere in terms of a move to IPTV. That's certainly been mooted here by a few politicians on the right, which of course, broadband delivery, which would require a subscription to internet service providers and then turns those ISPs into gatekeepers, apart from the other problem of relying on a continuing policy of net neutrality. But I think that's probably one of the greatest threats to the BBC and to public media in general. So that's the third, reach. The fourth strength is resources. Until actually quite recently, the BBC has been adequately funded to continue its investment in that kind of original high quality content across the board. The last 10 years has been different following the crash of 2008, although to some extent that was used as an excuse. We've seen progressive real terms funding cuts that have started to undermine the BBC's ability to continue at the same level. So that's resources. Then finally, trust. I think the BBC's contribution to the nation's democratic welfare in an age of disinformation has been key, with a reputation for trustworthiness through a long tradition of impartiality, accuracy, and of course independence from government. And that trust has become far more significant over the last few years. And I think both the presentations that the last 3 or 4 presentations have made that point as well. Just adding to that, I wanted to draw attention to a report from the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance based in Stockholm, which some of you will know. Its latest report began, democracy is at risk. The world is becoming more authoritarian as non-democratic regimes become even more brazen. And many democratic governments suffer from backsliding by restricting free speech and weakening the rule of law. And of course, we've seen this backsliding in many democracies, including places like Hungary, Turkey, India, and Brazil, where populist regimes are putting their own slavish supporters in charge of mainstream media. And a slightly different problem in the US, where lies and disinformation are promoted by anti-vaxxers, climate deniers, Trumpist Republicans through social media and partisan networks like Fox News. I find it actually quite terrifying that over 2/3 of Republicans still believe that Joe Biden didn't legitimately win the 2020 presidential election. So in that kind of global environment, the BBC's values, accuracy, truth, fairness, impartiality have become a fundamental part of the UK's information ecology, and its independence is still seen as a journalistic benchmark for other countries. So just to summarize, scale, scope, reach, resources, and trust based on a long history of independence from political influence. Those are the criteria that have sustained the BBC at the heart of British culture and democratic life. But as I said at the beginning, it's important not to get complacent. And there are 3 growing threats to the BBC's future, which I know are shared by public media institutions everywhere. The first is the BBC's competitors, in particular the newspaper publishers who regularly launch ferocious assaults on the BBC through news stories and columns. Chiefly, certainly for the last 50 years, has been Rupert Murdoch through his Times and Sun newspapers. Now, obviously, it's naked commercial self-interest, because highly trusted and freely available BBC journalism will impinge on the profitability of commercial publishers. And Hanu's description of the challenges being made to YLA is very reminiscent of the kinds of accusations regularly leveled at the BBC by similarly powerful publishers in the UK. But those protests, as in Finland, are becoming louder as their circulations diminish. So that's the first threat. The second is a threat to BBC funding through the series of below inflation settlements that I've talked about, but also through further spending obligations, which have effectively top-sliced BBC revenue to pay for things like broadband rollout and local TV stations. People may know that just 3 weeks ago, our culture secretary announced a freeze in the license fee for the next 2 years, which will almost certainly involve the closure of one or more BBC services. That's on top of the 30% reduction in revenue in real terms over the last 10 years. So that's the second threat. The third, finally, is the threat to BBC independence from this particular government, the Boris Johnson government. Now, the BBC has faced political threats before, and I don't think it's terminal, but we have a populist prime minister who has banished moderate conservative voices and borrows his political narrative from other populist leaders, particularly around elites. He likes to talk about the corporate elites, media elites, metropolitan elites, God help us, academic elites who are conspiring to deceive the people, which we might think is ironic coming from an old Etonian who went to Oxford University, has always lived in London and comes from a wealthy political family. But the fact is that we are in the grip of a powerful and actually quite unpredictable government, which has shown itself to be pretty ruthless in prioritizing the hardline wing of its own party over the country and public service. Now, I don't want to overplay this threat because there are long-standing structures in place that should protect the BBC at least until the next election. I'm not going to go into detail. We can discuss it in greater detail if anyone wants to, but there is the main BBC board, the unitary board, where the majority are not government appointments, although the chairman is. And there's the BBC's backstop regulator, Ofcom, which has so far maintained its separation from government and for the moment can head off any real threat to BBC's survival. But I have to say, if the same regime wins the next election in 2023 or 2024, there will be some major changes both on funding and governance, and I would certainly fear for the BBC's future. So in conclusion, there's no question that the voices of opposition to public media and to the BBC in particular in the UK are growing louder, as I know they are in other countries, particularly given the abundance of original content from the American streamers, Netflix, Disney, Amazon, etc., and the proliferation of online news sources, news and information sources, which obviously raise questions about spending taxpayer money on a public media institution. But I do think that in the UK, the case for a vigorous and well-resourced BBC today is actually stronger than ever, and that those arguments can translate to other countries, that we need a guaranteed supply of original local content that reflects the regions and the disparate ethnic groups of a particular country. We need some insurance against the rising tide of disinformation and conspiracy theories that are fueling autocratic regimes around the world. And we need a trusted, easily accessible, and crucially, universally available public space, which can be accessed by every single individual in the country. And those, I think, are criteria that, as I say, apply almost universally. I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We will be coming back to BBC with our last speaker, but now I would like to invite Maria Heller, professor at Eötvös Loránd University, LTE, from Budapest. So Maria, the floor is yours.
Hello, thank you. And thank you for having invited me to this very interesting conference. I did not prepare slides, I'm sorry. And also I have to talk about a completely different story compared to what you and all the other presenters did so far. And especially the biggest contrast is with what Stephen Bernay said about the BBC, this very interesting and trustworthy institution. We don't have anything like that in Hungary. It's the Hungarian media landscape is really a catastrophic situation. You might know that Orbán has been in power for 12 consecutive years, but he already had a first government from 1998 to 2002. And they have done a lot of damage in the country, not only about the economic life of the country, but very much so in education, culture, research, and the media. Orban was able to construct a regime with completely authoritarian features, dismantling the rule of law, and he's in a constant cultural warfare, a kind of a Kulturkampf against intellectuals, against liberal intellectuals especially. And he has been using EU funds for the construction of this illiberal regime. And the main feature of this construction is what you could call a state capture. So they have abolished checks and balances in the country and emptied the democratic institutions. They made corruption systemic and systematic in the country. We also have to say why media is so important for Fidesz and for Orban, because mainly they see governance as a communication activity. So propaganda is very important for them. And so nowadays, the politicians are not selected according to their expertise in whatever field would be, but according to their media performance and capacity of playing in the media. So they, for instance, ministers or state secretaries do not make decisions, but they represent in the media the central power and communicate the centrally conceived messages. So this state capture also means that they have been able to develop a kind of a parallel state. So it means that even if there is an electoral defeat, they still control much of the public life of the country and the different fields. There will be a new parliamentary elections in the 3rd of April. And so there is a big question what will happen and whether they will be able to keep in power. So in order to construct this parallel state, they used a new method. They invented a new method. They have created a new type of foundations. These are kind of trusts which are equipped with some kind of public functions, and they are richly financed from public funds. But the managers, the directors, and the boards of these funds have been appointed by Orban, and they are the members of his oligarchy. And the management conditions of these foundations are very pleasant for them, so they are practically unaccountable on any spending or how they use the money of these foundations. Although there are very huge sums of money which are withdrawn from public scrutiny and that were given to these foundations. And there is a very well-known and often cited slogan which was invented by Fidesz, which means that public money is losing its public character. So this is exactly what happens with these foundations. The Orban politics is mainly symbolic politics, which is based on national symbols, Christian symbols, but also some ancient Hungarian mythological symbols. It's a kind of a complete mixture of eclecticism in communication. They have occupied all or most of the state-run institutions and ousted independent artists, intellectuals, under another slogan, changing of the guard. And they promote the intellectuals who are devoted to Fidesz. In the media, we also see increasingly military rhetoric and an overwhelming government propaganda in all the media fields, with a lot of slander and scapegoating discourse. So at the end of my presentation, I will speak a little bit about the content of the media. But first of all, how they were able to occupy the public media. So it started already in 1998 and continued in 2010. So what they did was that they occupied the publicly funded media, purged the staff, and got direct control over about 80% of the media landscape. They used administrative and market strategies in this. Administrative strategies, I mean, for instance, withdrawing broadcasting licenses, or using state advertising in financing the media. This is one of the most important uses of how they managed to get control over the media, and also giving fines to those media outlets that do not comply. But also market strategies, and that is very clear that they give a lot of public money to the different media outlets where they are either owners or have control on them. And on top of this public money, there is a huge amount which is paid to the complying media for advertising. And they are boosting the media which is close to the government. They are buying up other media outlets which do not comply, or just push them out of the media market with all kinds of either legal or illegal methods. So I would say that there is also not only the state advertising is paying for the media which are complying with the Fidesz and the government, but there is also a way of menacing all multinational or national companies who would advertise in the opposition media. So most of these do not dare to do this. So in a sense, the independent media, which is a very small share of the whole media market, they are striving to stay alive. But it is also interesting to see that there is a short number of independent media, because it is also important for the Fidesz to demonstrate, especially for the EU, that the expression of opinion is ensured in Hungary. So the public media since 2010 has become really the mouthpiece of government propaganda, very one-sided, biased, partial. We are witnessing the distortion of news, misinformation, and suppressed news. And it's not only in the news media that it is so, but it is also in the cultural and educational programs. And it's also interesting to see that there are some researches about that, to see who are participating actively in media programs. And what we see is that it's always more and more featuring artists or public figures who are close to the government. If I have to give some information about the finances, I have to say that in 2020, there was an increase in state financing of advertisement on the media of 14% compared to 2019. And 85% of this state financing goes into pro-government media. If we consider the support from the state into the media industry, it's 6 times more than the whole expenditure of the commercial media. So it's really huge. The organization of the whole media landscape also changed. And this is interesting to know how this happened, because Fidesz started to build up this media empire already in around 2010 when they got into power. And the whole media empire then was directed by the treasurer of Fidesz, who is a friend and former classmate of Orban. But around 2014 and 15, Orban realized that this guy called Šimička has too much power in his hands. So he started to get rid of him in the media and also in the treasury of Fidesz. So what happened was there was an open warfare which broke out in 2015, and Šimička attacked Orban in the public, which made that there was an open warfare between them. And it was very interesting to see that all the media that belonged to Šimička all of a sudden became critical of the government. The same media outlets that until then were very complacent with the power, with the central power. So then what happened that after the next election, after this time, Šimička had to realize that even with this move, he was unable to oust Orban from power. So he just decided to hand in and sell all his media empire to the oligarchy around Orban. And this is what happened, because Orban, and now we know after having done some research, that very clear guidelines and orders were given to the oligarchy to buy up everything that belonged to Šimička and to all other players in the field. And the party financed from public money all these buying up of the whole media field. They also funded some new outlets, but mainly bought up the other ones and destroyed those that were impossible to get under their control. So for instance, Népszabadság, the most important daily political newspaper, was just closed down. So in 2015, all of a sudden, there was a big media empire, a new media empire. And what happened is that at that time, Orban decided to put all these media outlets into one big foundation. And this is what happened. And you can just imagine that in 2018, more than 500 media products have been handed into a kind of a foundation, which is called Central European Media and Press Foundation. So all the oligarchs who until then bought up the media landscape in Hungary, all of a sudden on one day and on one and the same day, just handed over for free their media products and their media outlets to this new foundation. So this shows to what extent the whole thing has been financed by public funds. And it was interesting to see that the Hungarian Competition Authority could not even examine this case, because Orban all of a sudden announced that this whole foundation was of national strategic significance, and what is national strategic significance cannot be examined by the Competition Authority. So if you want me to summarize how this situation is now, I would have to say that there is only one independent national TV channel, which is RTL Club. It's Bertelsmann's channel. There is no national independent radio channel. There is no completely independent national daily newspaper. And what is the less dominated is the online media in the country. And again, of course, you can understand how this is able to function. It is because all these media outlets are financed by the public money. There is no fee in the country. It's just the budget which is paying for all these media outlets, while the independent media is blocked also by financial and political means. First of all, that they don't get the state fund advertisements, and private companies are encouraged to advertise in the media outlets of the oligarchs or this foundation. They also, the companies get tax and other benefits if they do so, but they are also threatened with sanctions if they advertise in the few independent media. Also, political means are used. So, for instance, licenses are withdrawn. They get fines, and there are new laws and regulations with political aims. So, one could say that there is really restriction on the freedom of information and the freedom of getting informed. The content of all these media is a constant repetition of the government propaganda, and very much so through tabloidization, brainwashing, a kind of demagogic and populist discursive mode. And so if media content is analyzed, you only get the repetition of simple, emotionally manipulative messages, creation of enemy images, character assassination of the opposition political figures, ad hominem attacks on them, and the production of alternative realities with mixing true and false news. And it's very interesting to see how, to what extent Orban and the oligarchy is, and the political structure is using the new social platforms. They are very keen on using them, because the social platforms are very applicable for mobilization of the population. And it goes into such a situation that Orban sometimes announces very important decisions, laws, on his Facebook page. And the politicians are encouraged to also use their Facebook pages. So what happens is that they keep on posting things on their own private Facebook pages, and then very quickly other governmental figures also post on the other people's Facebook posts. So there is a complete and constant Facebook propaganda also in helping to brainwash the people, especially those who wouldn't use other media, especially news media. So just a few more words. The two largest internet news portals belong to the to Fidesz now. If we talk about radios, in 2010 there were 250 independent broadcasters. Now there are less than 100. And one of the most interesting thing was that the only opposition radio, Klub Radio, has lost most of its frequency. And the last one was a year ago. It was deprived of its last Budapest frequency. So now this radio can only be accessed on the internet, and it is community funded. So only the listeners pay for the existence of this media. Another thing is that the digital media network was sabotaged by the high authority of media. They don't want to see go the media landscape into online or digital broadcasting. And the biggest loser of this whole thing was the printed press. In 2010, already there were 100 million fewer examples of printed press than 1 year before. And since it has dropped even more. So if, for instance, just to give you a figure, the dailies in the countryside, which are nearly all the same. We have 9 counties, and normally they have their special dailies, but they are almost the same. And their numbers have fallen from 450,000 to 270,000. And most of these went through tabloidization very much. Just another thing is the National News Agency, NTI, was also fell into the hands of Fidesz, and so now it is completely controlled by the Fidesz and only emitting completely biased information. Just to give you an example, there were pre-elections organized by the opposition during this autumn, and there was no information about it in the National News Agency. And just one more thing, that Orban also used the corona situation in order to suppress information even more, or restrict access to information. So we had very biased news about the whole virus situation with hidden numbers and concealed and distorted information, which also makes probably for the fact that Hungary has the highest death rates proportionally to its population in the whole world. And so they were able to push even further the possibility of classifying information. And so most of the very important information are secret until 2050. And I think that my time is up, so I think that I will finish here.
Thank you for these important insights. Our next speaker is Maria Michalis. She is co-president of the International Association of Public Media Researchers and associate professor at the University of Westminster.
Thank you. I will share my screen and then start. Okay, so hopefully it's working.
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here. And thank you to all the previous speakers. What I will do is I will try not to repeat what has already been said, rather to emphasize some key points, and then I'll move on with my presentation, which will focus more on governance. So to start with, from the very start, as we've heard, PSB has been facing challenges. Technological, political, ideological, societal, and market pressures. Now, more recently to these pre-existing pressures, we have a new set of challenges that have come about with the advent of the internet, the rise of big commercial social media platforms, the emergence of online television and transnational video on demand players. Now, these new challenges are, first of all, the internationalization of competition. And we have to remember that by definition, public service broadcasters are national and local. So now we have big media and technological players operating across national borders. The second challenge is that more and more we access media content via platforms. And this matters because with platforms, we have a new set of powerful intermediaries that control key aspects of our media consumption and can shape also media production, visibility, findability, and so on. The dominant business model is the commercial exploitation of data. All these developments have impacted on media consumption. So increasingly we have on-demand consumption, personalized consumption, and that essentially means audience fragmentation. And we also very clearly heard about the rise of misinformation and the rise of populism. Now, just to remind ourselves about the purpose of public service broadcasting, public service media. As we've heard, and I totally agree, public service broadcasting is about citizenship. The fundamental characteristic and key differentiation element of public service media compared to commercial media is that PSB addresses audiences as public citizens, not individual consumers. And the ultimate aim is to inform and engage society, support and facilitate, as Slavko was saying, a public sphere, a public space for debates about and hopefully decisions on shared concerns. And another key characteristic, another key aim that is very important, and it has to do with social cohesion, is that PSB nurtures a sense of common purpose. Where do we go as a society? And it enables an understanding and debate across different segments of society. So PSB is about citizenship, and citizenship is preconditioned on a set of rights. So for instance, Graham Murdoch talks about the right to information, to knowledge, to deliberation, to representation and participation. And this is the essence of public service media. Now, there is a clear and direct link between this understanding of public service media and its governance. The two go together. And the one reinforces the other. And the EBU, the European Broadcasting Union, based on this understanding of public service media, as I've just explained, has come up with 4 what it calls enabling governance principles. So the first one is independence, no undue interference by political or economic powers. The second, accountability, PSM answerable to supervisory bodies, and importantly to the public at large. The third is transparency, openness, and responsiveness. And finally, sustainability. PSM have to be capable of serving the evolving needs of society. From this, you can see that some of these arrangements are about external governance and some refer to internal governance. External governance is basically the overarching policy and regulatory framework and arrangements for funding and appointments. But we shouldn't forget also the internal governance aspects. Internal governance refers to the operationalization and internalization of these governance principles. In other words, how these principles guide senior management and indeed the overall running of the PSB organization. And I'm very pleased to see that the draft legislation that's currently in debate in Slovenia addresses these governance principles in a positive way. So moving on, not that long ago, we thought that PSM faced challenges in some parts of the world. Perhaps to group them in the so-called global south, and also in the European continent in countries in transition, and so on. But we thought that public service media were quite safe in the heartlands, that is mostly Western and Northern European countries. And of course, this is not the case, as we heard loud and clear. The challenges, the pressures on PSM are now everywhere. And what we see is the deliberate instrumentalization of governance arrangements to undermine PSM and to serve narrow vested political and economic interests. I have come up with 3 categories because perhaps the pressures are slightly different, and I don't want to make this too strong a point. So starting with the heartland of PSP, the established liberal democracies, and we heard recent developments from Germany, Finland, Britain. There are very strong pressures, in particular regarding the independence of public service broadcasters and funding. So independence from economic and political power. For instance, public service broadcasters rely more and more on big commercial media and technological giants. They represent the economic power. But there are also growing concerns around political interference, and we heard examples, political interference in the editorial and operational independence of PSBs. Turning to funding, there are changes concerning real reductions in the funding of PSBs. Steve, for instance, mentioned the formidable 30%, that's 30% decline in real terms in the funding of the BBC in the decade since 2010. And further reductions were announced recently by the government. We've also touched on changes in the funding mechanism, this shift from license fee to funding through taxation and state budgets. Now, it depends how this is done, but this could be interpreted as an attempt to reduce the independence of PSBs in question and reduce, that's the ultimate aim, their ability to hold government to account and to limit their provision of programs and services. A second category is post-communist countries. In addition to the above challenges, we can largely say that in most cases, at least, the move from state media to a dual system of public service and commercial media has largely failed. In many cases, what we have is a back to the future scenario. So we're going back quite rapidly to state media with strong examples of media capture. I mean, Maria just before me gave us an overview of what's been happening in Hungary. The last category we haven't really touched on, countries unfamiliar with or politically hostile to public service broadcasting and public service media. Perhaps we can touch on this in the Q&A later. So to conclude, first of all, I want to emphasize this direct and clear link between what PSM stands for, the PSM principles and goals, and the governance framework, and the two go together. You cannot have PSM unless you have a supporting and enabling governance framework in place. What we are very clearly witnessing is that democracy is being challenged, and not surprisingly, PSM are under attack everywhere. And it's just when we need PSM more. So PSM as a concept, as principles, as aims is not outdated. On the contrary, we need more public service media. But public service media requires strong political commitment and an appropriate governance framework. And my last point is that PSM are not islands. They operate in a much broader, highly commercial media ecology. So when we discuss the future of PSM and their governance, that should be part of the broader debate on the governance of online platforms. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Maria. So this brought us to our last speaker, Professor Stephen Coleman. He comes from the University of Leeds. Professor Coleman, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Boris. I think one conclusion that is beginning to occur to me, having heard all
if I may, we're not hearing you very well, so if you can just adjust your volume or microphone.
Is that better?
Yeah, much better. Thank you.
I'm sorry. One conclusion that is occurring to me listening to these terrifically illuminating presentations is that we need to develop a clear and convincing and adaptable model of what we mean by civically nourishing public communication. Where do we look? It seems to me that we should not be too attached to institutional models, but we should be attached to principles. So let's think about the BBC, which is closest to my experience. Can we see that as a model for public service communication? And the question that then follows is, which BBC? Is it the 100-year-old institution rooted in a patrician cultural tradition, as public service providers were at the beginning of the 20th century, which saw themselves as having a cultivation role of molding the public rather than responding to or reflecting the public? Or is it the BBC as a democratic ideal that is never quite empirically realized, but which offers a feasible vision of how democratic societies might speak to themselves? And I think if we want to focus on principles, it's worth asking what is at stake. And I think three things are at stake. And the first is the principle of how you manage a common good, how you manage what economists call an externality, and in particular, they call it a merit good. Merit goods are goods that you don't know are good for you until you've experienced them. So it's knowledge that you didn't know you needed, but once you have the knowledge, you certainly realize you needed it. It's exposure to cultural perspectives that you might actually have found offensive, distasteful, uninteresting, but which once exposed to them, you become a fuller kind of person. It's awareness of invisible or peripheral agendas, perhaps even agendas that we really don't want to know about, which start to open up our eyes. And the problem for the governance of any civic model for the media is that it has to have the strength and determination to go out and tell people not what they demand, but what they need, what society needs, and what culture needs. And the responsibility for doing that, as Slavko said right at the beginning, is totally different from a gas provider or an electricity provider, where we don't have a lot of arguments about how you make gas or how you make electricity, but we have enormous and important and necessary argument about how we make culture. So you see, the second thing that's at stake is what I would call a civic mode of address. That's what I think defines public service communication. It's a way of speaking to people and to each other, which doesn't only assume that we're citizens, because that begs the question, what is a citizen? But which assumes that there are certain types of common knowledge that we cannot do without. If I'm the only person who knows that a green traffic light means drive on, then that's not going to help society. Everyone has to know it. So it's the importance of common knowledge, of conversation, of contestation, and of a very fine balance between pluralism of culture, plurality of culture, and cohesion of culture. And if you have too much of one, you destroy the other. So you've got to allow for plurality, but you've also got to have cohesion. And that is a big governance problem. And then the third problem, and I don't need to go into it in any detail, particularly after Maria's very important presentation from Hungary, is about the vulnerability of cultural civic values. They are vulnerable. They're vulnerable in three ways. They're vulnerable to political and commercial interests, of course. They're vulnerable to what we might call ideology, an ideology that sees the civic as being somehow distasteful, a disruption of the market, something that you know, it's okay for intellectuals to talk about, but we shouldn't take too seriously. But it is also vulnerable. Civic values are also vulnerable to inertia, just not talking about them as we are now. And it does seem to me that the question that I take away from Maria's presentation is Hungary an outlier or is it a trendsetter? So I want to conclude by asking, how can public service communication bodies, systems, institutions, organizations, networks, how can they be sustainable, remain sustainable and relevant? And I want to suggest four things which I think go to the heart of the governance, not only of the BBC, but of the many other organizations we've heard about today. The first is the need to be bold in tackling state overreach. But that boldness has got to be a very specific kind of boldness, because as a broadcaster or a public communicator, there is always a balance between autonomy and responsibility to the wider culture. And sometimes it's governments, parliaments, local authorities understand that responsibility to the local culture better than broadcasters. So there has to be a constant dialogue between them and not simply an assumed antagonism. The second way of making PSB, public service communication, sustainable and relevant is by thinking about new forms of accountability. We've got into a rut, a 20th century rut. What do we mean by accountability? Largely consultations, which are poorly managed and often not well analysed, and audience research. What we need to be thinking about, I think, is stakeholder governance. How do we get local communities and communities of interest into the governing bodies of public service communicators? And also real-time feedback. The technology has got ahead of our accountability assumptions. Real-time feedback is now a possibility, and we need to be looking at it and listening to it and analysing it. The third means of relevance that I want to propose is the importance, as Maria just said, of keeping up with the new media ecology, where there is a lack of global regulation, a lack of standards, and whatever you want to do at a national governance level, you can't actually do it because you're dealing with corporations that are global and have no kind of commitment to national sovereignties. And that means that nationally organized public service communicators have got to work with what is nationally doable. And fourthly, this is where most of my work in research operates, there is a need to constantly refresh the civic mission of public service communicators. not just in terms of media content, so that we provide things for young people, all very important, but we recognize the changing repertoires, innovations, and pathologies of civic practice. Citizenship is not being practiced in the same way as it was in the early days of the BBC. Why should the BBC be practiced or governed along that old model? So we have to catch up with citizen science, with deliberative methods, with new forms of civic expression, with new forms of intersection between politics and popular culture, which is where I suspect much of the energy of future citizenship is going to come from. So I just want to conclude by saying, in thanking you for including me in this discussion, that where we began is where we should stay. It's about citizenship. Who is the guardian of citizenship? We can't ask citizens to spontaneously do it for themselves. That's why we have an education system. That's why we fund museums and other forms of cultural display. And that's why the communication system we developed has got to be not something that speaks to citizenship, but something that emanates from citizenship.
Thank you. Indeed, thank all of the speakers for your thoughts and insights. We have now come to the part where we invite the members of the public to share their comments and questions. In order to optimize this process, I would ask anybody who would like to address a question or a comment to use a hand icon or to use a chat function in this Zoom application. So, do we already have a question? Maybe from the representatives of the public media?
There are two.
Okay, so we can start with Sylvia Harvey. Just, yeah.
Yes, thank you very much to Slavko organizing the event, and especially to Maria Heller from Hungary. I wanted to make 3 quick points, if I may. They're rather obvious. Well, the first 2 are, the stronger the democracy, the stronger the public service media. Secondly, we need to watch very carefully the ways in which the market is requiring changes in measurement, in the way that we measure things. So, for example, in the UK, the gold standard of audience measurement produced by Barb, they're still in negotiations with the streamers to try to get data on audience use. So the market is starting to impact on methods of measurement. Thirdly, particularly in relationship to non-democratic cultures, I wanted to refer to a recent Russian film. It's called Petrov's Flu. That is the influenza, the flu suffered by Petrov. And it's an extraordinary, mad and wild and strange and surreal vision of Russia. But it has within it some very important truths, which in my opinion is like the voice of the fool in Shakespeare's England, in the royal courts, the undemocratic royal courts, the voice that's able to get through the risk of being destroyed to speak.
Thank you. So, Barbara, I believe you have also a question or comment?
I would prefer others to speak, but if there is none, I have a point which is really important for me, because it's going through our presentations and the discussions, and as well the chat that we have. Unfortunately, Karen left now. But I want to warn to put principles and institutions as thought as a conflicting principles. I fully agree to say we have to have these principles and we have to focus on when we look at the institutions, but we shouldn't play one after the other. What we observe in those pressures that are coming, and Maria pointed it out in the different areas very well, the pressure is working by hurting the institutions or making the institutions weak. And I think this point that I tried to address in the beginning, the idea, I love this really from Timothy Snyder, defend institutions is so important. He says institutions help us to maintain decency, but they need our help. Institutions do not protect themselves. They fall one after the other if each one is not defended from the beginning. And I think our idea should go more and work wherever we work as scholars, or some of us are practically in these fields, to try to make these principles in the existing institutions work. I think this is where we should try to reconcile these by both principles, because institutions that are gone, they are very, very, very difficult to rebuild again. And we saw this even in democratic countries like New Zealand and so on. So principles, yes, but try to improve their implementation in the existing institutions where we still have the possibility.
Thank you. So do we have any questions or comments?
That is one more.
Yeah, please. Klaus, go ahead.
Okay, well then, if there's no other question, I really want to support what Barbara just has said. For me, some of the presentations have been absolutely alarming. I never would have expected a situation like that when I started my career in public service media. So that's definitely bad news, and it's a call for action. However, I think there are some good news as well, and we should not forget that, especially my Slovenian friends, you know, they should have a reason for working, a good reason for working for public service media, and not just defending what has left. Yeah, so I don't want to lead you in a kind of miserable state. So I'm just pointing out two things. First of all, I've mentioned that in the chat room, there's an international initiative of scientists supporting the idea of a public service internet. And this is not a recipe, this is not a single solution, but it gives a positive vision what public service media could be, yeah, in the future. And I think this is what we actually need, because we have to inspire the next generation, the young generation. I'm 60 now, you know, I'm gone in a few, no, hopefully I will live on a little bit, a while. But, you know, public service media is in the hands of the new generation. And if we cannot open the door to the next generation with a positive, empowering vision, then we are gone in beauty. We will die in beauty. So therefore, I would very much inspire to open the door to the new generation. And there are enough reasons, because what we learned, and this would be my last point, what we learned in the pandemic in the last 2 years is not just polarization of societies, but also a renaissance of the common good, of a society of social cohesion. And I think if we can join forces with some of these young people who want to inspire social cohesion, maybe in their own mindset, you know, then it would be a connective point for public service media. So citizenship, yes, everything yes to what I've seen here. We certainly have to help our colleagues in Hungary, in Poland, so not forget about that. But connect with the younger generation via the concept of citizenship. And that would be a positive outlook for public service media in my country, in Slovenia, but hopefully also at the BBC in England, because if the giant falls, then I think we're in a miserable state. But don't forget the positive vision.
Thank you. Maria Michalis, then Maria Heller, and after them, Josef Borg.
Okay, thank you. I mean, my point was to really support what Barbara was saying, and I agree with this. And then Klaus also supported this point. In countries where we have established public service broadcasters, institutions, organizations, we shouldn't be throwing that away when we think about the future of public service media. I think this is very, very important. I think in these countries, we can have a discussion of PSB organizations plus, and the plus is, for instance, if you don't have local media and you have some initiatives, and whether you can include this under the umbrella of public service media, things like that. But the institutions, the public service broadcasters, the organizations that exist are definitely a fundamental part of what we want to achieve, and we cannot throw them out of the picture. So I totally agree with Barbara. It's different in other countries where you don't have these established organizations. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
If I am the next one, I just want to ask Slavko or other Slovenian colleagues. I read the draft law. It's very impressive. And my question is, what do you think about its future? What are the chances to being accepted? And how do you see the situation now? Thank you.
Slavko, would you like to address that?
Maybe at the end.
Okay. So Josef, and after Josef, Tanya. Josef, please.
Steve raised the hand. Yes, okay.
Steve, okay.
Okay, apologies. I'm Joseph Borg from the University of Malta, so I think I come from the smallest country which is represented here, and we have our own sort of setup. And I think the conference was very, very interesting. Although we are a very small country, there are several things which are similar, but others which are different. For example, in our case, besides the public service broadcaster, we have media organizations which are owned by the main political parties. So our two main political parties, both of them have a television station, a radio station, newspapers, and a news website. So in our case, the scenario is divided between the public service broadcaster, the political owned media, and the commercially owned media. Also because history, as everyone said, history and the setting is very, very important. In our case, the public service broadcaster behaves more like a state broadcaster than a public service broadcaster. There has been a very long tradition of control by government, and I think we neither have institutions which guarantee autonomy, but also when experiments were done in this direction, the culture of autonomy is not present amongst many people working in the public service. In public service broadcaster. At the moment, there is a commission set up by government to try to reform, not our media system, but to introduce reforms in journalism, in the area of journalism, to strengthen the area of journalism. But unfortunately, the reforms that are being proposed by government are very, very weak and do not in any way instill a greater culture of autonomy and give adequate protection to journalists.
Thank you. So Steve, then Tanya, and at last Stephen.
I just wanted to also, like Maria, I wanted to endorse what both Barbara and Klaus were saying about the importance of institutions. And I think it's not just about having a tangible representation of the kinds of the kinds of qualities, the things like citizenship and democracy that we are trying to foster. But it's also about the ways in which we are trying to foster those values within the individuals who work there. And I think that comes back to the question about bringing young people into the fold. And I can certainly tell you, as someone who is still at the ripe old age of 68, teaching aspiring journalists, that those who go into the BBC are exposed to a very different set of democratic and cultural and citizenship values than those who go and work for, well, I'm tempted to say the Daily Mail, but that's pretty obvious, but even somewhere like the Financial Times, because they are subjected to a working environment in which the kinds of values that we've been talking about, particularly values around accuracy, around impartiality, around your obligation to the people that you are providing material for, those are the main priorities. And those kinds of institutional values you carry through into your career, into your work, and I think society benefits as a result. I think it's much more difficult to inculcate those sorts of values and those kinds of working practices if you have them spread around a number of different organizations, particularly those, and I'm not averse to the idea of profit making, but as soon as you introduce the profit motive and shareholder value, you have a very different set of values and objectives, which are not prioritizing public service. So I think for all those reasons, I think we really need to try and preserve the nature of those institutions. And that then comes back to the questions of how you fund them and then how you make them accountable, both politically to elected governments, but also to the wider general public.
Thank you. Tanya, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. And thanks all the panelists for their interesting presentations and in this intriguing discussions. I have to admit, I was quite unwell when listening to the presentation of Maria Heller from Hungary, because I had this feeling, I think many of my Slovenian colleagues share, that we are following the same path, unfortunately. So it was reading from the same book about all these strategies that the governments are using for subordinating the media and making the media system according to their vision. And I was also quite intrigued by what Karen said, and it would be good to hear something more about the reform they made in Belgium. Unfortunately, she had to leave, but I think we could say a few words maybe on what she posted in the chat just before she left. And she said that she is supportive of European Union being more strict in defending fundamental values and more and including the values of public service media. And related to what's happening at the moment in EU policy making related to media and related to digital platform, I would like to hear your thoughts on whether you see there's a real room for the European Union to intervene in this sphere more, especially with regard to this really fragmented situation we currently have in terms of governance of the public service media, where we can also see that not all the solutions that can be functional in one environment can be easily transposed to another environment. So I would like to hear if anyone could share some thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. So.
Stephen raised hand.
Sorry?
Stephen?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Stephen, go ahead.
I just wanted to underline the point that Sylvia Harvey made earlier about the relationship between the strength of public service media and the strength of democracy. But that works both ways. It is part of the job of public service media to strengthen that democracy, but also media organizations are dependent on what goes on around them. But I have a question. Where does this idea of what has been referred to as throwing out institutions come from? I haven't heard it in this discussion. I've certainly heard it from people who want to attack the principle of public service communication. But it seems to me there's a difference between throwing out institutions and refreshing them in ways that might be uncomfortable for some of the people within them, and indeed for some of the people who see themselves as their most ardent supporters. Talking about local public service media, for me, I think the BBC has retreated a long way from its civic mission. It is, there are the grassroots attitudes that Steve has spoken about from new and enthusiastic reporters, but actually at the top, the BBC has become timid. It has become, it has made some extremely bad decisions from the point of view of the public interest. And as an institution, it has to be refreshed. And it's not about throwing out, but the danger is that if one takes either a small c conservative or complacent view of public service communication, I don't think it's going to flourish.
Thank you. Barbara?
Yes, if I may, I'd like to give to answer to Tanya, but just before, Stephen, I'm happy that you made this clear again. I didn't want to speak about throwing out, but not to oppose it too much. But concerning your question, where's the room or the space to maneuver for the EU? I think this is a very important issue, and it is about what we as scholars can do to enlarge the space as well. We know that within the EU there is let's say, a strong competition between what the Parliament, the Council of Europe is doing with the media, and the EU Commission, which is very much focused only on the competitive or the competition laws. But at the moment, for an ongoing time, as the EU is preparing a new Media Freedom Act, this would be, and it is very in the early stage still, this would be, I think, an important point or phase where scholars as well speak up and make this a strong point, because to my impression at the moment there's just only this sort of impact assessment going on about preparing this Media Freedom Act, and there the focus is very much on the competitive side, on the side in how far do the media markets work that they are accessible for new competitors. But to reduce the whole question of media freedom to the question of competition and to free competition and pluralistic markets and so on, this would be again sort of a reduction. So I think it is indeed about holding, as well as they talk now a lot about EU values which have to be defended and so on. This is the point that was obvious in many presentations as well. Defending public service media as democratic institutions and strengthening the democratic values in them, of course. This is a part of the EU value and should enter as well in the activities where the EU is active in the media field, and the preparation of the new Media Freedom Act might be one of these points where to act. Thank you.
Thank you. So if we have no further questions, I would like to give a word to Slavko Sprihal to make the concluding remarks. Slavko, go ahead.
Thank you. To make the final decision what to do. So, first, I would like to say that I really enjoyed very much the presentations today. But I also have to say that I was also getting increasingly frustrated in a way while listening to the many cases of increased pressure against public service media in all the countries, essentially that were discussed this morning or this afternoon now. Nevertheless, I hope that at least some of critical ideas discussed today will resonate for some time in the future debates on public service media and public service internet, of course, which was mentioned both in Slovenia and elsewhere. Since Maria asked about the situation in Slovenia, I only would say that this draft proposal of the public service law is actually a civic initiative. It's far from entering the legislative process, but we tend to use it as kind of initiative to start the discussions on the importance of public service media along the lines actually discussed this morning in the conference. So mentioning this, as I said, some critical ideas to be considered later in public debates, I would particularly emphasize or repeat some of the principles that were emphasized during the presentations. First, the need for sustainable funding based on license fee, and second, the need for a democratic governance of public service media, excluding direct interference by government and political parties. In these two cases, I think it's clearly there is a very close connection between the principles on the one hand, the principle of autonomy and sustainability, and the institutionalization, the need of institutionalization of these principles on the other hand. And it's of course also closely related to the basic values which still I would hope prevail in the European Union. So I see this discussion about on the one hand, civic initiatives, on the other hand, institutions, or the need to institutionalize these grassroots actions as closely related to each other. So it's without very strong but independent institutions, I think the idea of public service in general, public service media is not workable at all. In addition to this two basic principles of autonomy and sustainability, I think there were many very important ideas expressed this morning. I just was to somehow to bring some of them to the attention while concluding the meeting. I would like to mention again some of them. In the first place, certainly the importance of the digital transformation, the importance of platformization of economy and communication, which makes a huge difference compared to the times where the idea of public service was firstly defined. perhaps even more important, I think, is the question related to the young, which I absolutely agree that the future public service media absolutely depends on how the young people would see their way to become in a way dominant in the public service media, as some of you show the figures indicating that the young actually lost the contact with the public service television and public service radio. And I absolutely agree with the warning that this is very important to keep in mind when discussing the future of public service media. And although I would like to say also and I would like to see some comparative data about what was the position of the young in relation to the television generally, or public service television in particular, during the former generations. So was this, or is this really so alarming as it can be interpreted without this comparative perspective? Or perhaps even the past time, television was not so much the medium of the young as we would like to have it. Then there are these principles emphasized by Steve, I think, talking about the BBC, the scale, the scope, the reach, the resources, and trust. And in particular, I think the question of the scope and related to the issue of entertainment, particularly in relation to what Barbara talked about, the ZDF and the discussion in Germany, and in relation to Hannah talked about Eiley. He mentioned these pressures to reduce the public service broadcaster position when it's in the kinds of communication that are not directly connected to television. And finally, this was the discussion a few minutes ago. I think, of course, there is a obvious needs to discuss new models of public service media, but at the same time, I think it's reasonable to conclude that this is not a question of establishing new institutions instead of the existing ones, but rather to think seriously about how the key values and key principles related to the idea of public service media, and more broadly to the idea of, or to the principle of publicness, are materialized through the existing institutions, and what should be changed within these institutions in order to make those principles and those values more, how to say it, up to date in empirical terms for the younger and newer generation. To conclude, I really am extremely thankful to all the participants, to all the presenters. I hope this is not the last meeting and last conference we organized on this topic, and I'm sure we'll be in contact very soon again. Thank you all, and we'll go back to Boris.
Thank you, Slavko. I have nothing much to add. I believe Barbara does, because you didn't.
No, this is just clapping my. This is just clapping my hands. It's just a symbol for clapping my hands.
So,
no
I would like to thank you all the presenters again. Thank you, Slavko, for organizing this. Hopefully we'll see each other soon with more bright ideas or more bright cases or to discuss, right? So thank you and stay safe.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye.
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 Bye.